Hello and welcome to SoulSpeak, the place where real crimes, lost truths, and timeless mysteries come alive. Tonight, we dive into one of the most legendary unsolved cases in American history, the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a man in a dark suit and sunglasses boards a flight from Portland to Seattle. Polite and composed, he orders a drink, hands the flight attendant a note, and quietly says, "I have a bomb." Within hours, he would collect $200,000 in cash, demand for parachutes, and leap from a Boeing 727 into the cold, stormy night, never to be seen again. No body, no parachute, no trace, only a name that became legend. D.B. Cooper, the man who stole a fortune and vanished into the sky. In the early 1970s, air travel in America was entering its golden age, fast, affordable, and surprisingly unguarded. Passengers could buy a ticket with cash, walk directly to the gate, and board without ever showing identification. There were no metal detectors, no baggage scans, and very few federal regulations on air safety. It was an era that valued convenience and trust, but it also left the door open for exploitation. That vulnerability became clear on November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, when Northwest Orient Flight 305 prepared for a short hop from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. The flight was ordinary, 37 passengers, 6 crew members, and a clear winter sky ahead. But one man, quiet, composed, and dressed like a businessman, would turn that routine trip into one of the most baffling crimes in American history. He called himself Dan Cooper. During the brief flight, Cooper handed a note to a flight attendant, calmly claiming he carried a bomb. His demands were direct: $200,000 in cash and for parachutes to be delivered when the plane landed in Seattle. After receiving the ransom and releasing the passengers, Cooper ordered the plane back into the air under precise conditions: low speed, low altitude, landing gear down, and somewhere over the forests of Washington. He opened the rear staircase of the Boeing 727 and jumped into the storm. What followed was unprecedented. The FBI launched Operation Noyak, the largest and longest-running hijacking investigation in its history. Yet despite thousands of interviews, searches across rugged terrain, and years of speculation, no trace of Cooper or most of the money was ever found. Over 50 years later, the D.B. Cooper case remains the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history. It exposed critical flaws in aviation security, changed airport screening forever, and became a permanent fixture of American folklore, a story suspended between fact, myth, and the endless question: what really happened to D.B. Cooper? On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a man presented himself at Portland International Airport and purchased a one-way ticket for Northwest Orient Flight 305 to Seattle. He paid cash, gave the name Dan Cooper, and carried a modest leather briefcase. Observers later described him as composed, neatly dressed in a dark suit, and neither conspicuous nor furtive an appearance that allowed him to board and take a seat without attracting attention. He settled into seat 18E toward the rear of the aircraft and kept the briefcase close. That ordinary opening act, buying a ticket and sitting quietly, would be the first deliberate move in a carefully staged sequence. Once the Boeing 727 climbed to cruising altitude on the short Portland-Seattle hop, the man's demeanor changed in a single, precise way. He asked to speak privately with a flight attendant. She accepted the request and moved to his row. He handed her a folded paper. The note read that he had a bomb. When she opened his briefcase at his request, she believed she saw an explosive device. He spoke calmly, without shouting or dramatics, making explicit demands he had clearly thought through: $200,000 in $20 bills, and for parachutes 2 main chutes with 2 backups. His voice and manner were steady, his instructions specific. By behaving in this way, he forced the crew and the airline into a procedural response rather than an immediate, panic-driven intervention. The immediate operational consequences were significant. The crew notified the airline and law enforcement, and the aircraft was diverted to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport to receive the demanded cash and parachutes. The exchange at SeaTac is one of the few fully documented moments that reflects both the hijacker's planning and his intent to leave in a controlled way. Upon landing, under security supervision, the airline provided marked currency serial numbers were recorded on the parachute. Equipment requested by the man was placed on board. After the transfer, the hijacker allowed all passengers and 2 flight attendants to disembark, leaving only the cockpit crew and 1 attendant aboard. That selective release reduced the number of witnesses while ensuring the aircraft could be flown to conditions suited to his planned exit. In this aspect, the incident looks less like a chaotic seizure and more like a negotiated transaction. The hijacker achieved compliance through threat and clear demands, and then managed the human environment to his operational advantage. Back in the air, the man specified detailed flight parameters. He insisted on a southerly heading toward Mexico City, but more importantly he demanded a low airspeed, a lower than normal cruising altitude, and flaps deployed to 15-degree settings uncommon for that stage of flight but appropriate for producing a manageable airflow and reduced turbulence at the rear of the aircraft. The Boeing 727's unique aft air stair made a mid-air exit physically possible under such conditions. The hijacker's request for these specific flight characteristics shows either prior technical knowledge or the guidance of someone who understood aircraft behavior. The pilots complied with his commands, flying the aircraft in a configuration that, while not standard, remained within controllable limits and minimized structural risk to the aircraft. In short, he set the environment for an exit that he clearly intended to make. As the flight proceeded, the cabin was dimmed and the aircraft's tone grew more measured. Crew statements indicate that the stair at the rear of the 727 was lowered while the plane maintained steady speed and heading. At some point during the return leg, in the late evening under poor weather conditions, wet, dark and cold, the hijacker used the aft stair to leave the aircraft. Flight logs and crew recollections place the event at approximately 2013 local time somewhere over southwestern Washington, a region of dense forest and river systems. The rear stair deployment in flight was an extraordinary maneuver but not necessarily fatal for the aircraft. The pilot's adherence to the low-speed flaps extended instructions mitigated the aerodynamic disturbance well enough to allow continued safe flight. What was extraordinary was the physical risk the act posed to the person exiting. Night, rain, unfamiliar terrain, and civilian parachute gear combined to make survival far from assured. The exact mechanics of the jump are subject to forensic and technical reconstruction. The jumper exited into the wake of a moving airframe where turbulence is pronounced. Even with lowered airspeed, the fuselage wake and the stair's geometry produced unpredictable vortices. A parachute requires a certain clearance and time to deploy fully. The lower the exit altitude, the less time any canopy has to fill, stabilize, and enable controlled descent. Parachutes provided by the airline intended, in principle, for emergency use were not uniform in quality. Reports detail at least one chute showing non-standard stitching, and civilian gear varies widely in reliability and steering capability. Night conditions compounded the difficulty. The jumper could not visually identify an optimal landing zone, judge altitude against terrain features as easily as during daylight, or see rivers and tree lines below. In operational terms, the exit combined marginal gear, marginal weather, and marginal altitude, a trifecta that strongly increased the odds of an uncontrolled landing or immediate incapacitation on impact. After the exit, the crew and pilots performed their imperative duties, stabilizing the aircraft, checking manifest and cabin, and contacting air traffic control. When the cabin was checked, the man was gone. No parachute canopy was observed trailing the aircraft, and the crew found only a few items left behind, most notably a clip-on tie. The flight, under the pilot's direction, proceeded to its scheduled diversion point where authorities deplaned the remaining crew, inventoried the aircraft, and began an immediate investigation. Initial ground searches and air patrols tried to establish a likely landing zone, but searches were complicated by darkness and the suspect terrain below, pockets of thick evergreen, rivers with dynamic currents, and swampy lowlands in November's wet season. Within hours, the investigative effort expanded, but the immediate physical trail on the ground was already weakened by environmental conditions, and the absence of any ground witnesses who reported seeing a parachute or a person. In the days and weeks following, forensic attention focused on the plane, the parachutes, and the marked bills. Inside the cabin, investigators collected items left behind and documented seating positions and crew testimony. The parachutes were examined for signs of use, damage, or modification details that could indicate whether they had been deployed or tampered with. But the chaotic post-flight handling environment and subsequent events obscured definitive conclusions. Serial numbers on the currency created an intentionally traceable set of financial markers. Investigators logged the numbers hoping to catch the hijacker if he spent the money through regular channels. That decision would later prove pivotal when, years after the jump, A portion of the marked money surfaced on the banks of the Columbia River. Technical reconstructions attempted to model likely exit points and probable drift given aircraft speed, altitude, wind, and parachute performance. Those reconstructions produced a broad corridor of possible landing zones rather than a single, searchable point. Given the variables exit airspeed, lateral drift due to wind, canopy stability and human error, analyzers could only identify a sweep area that encompassed rivers, marshes, and forest. Ground searchers used that model as a guide, but the broadness of the corridor multiplied the search area exponentially. Meteorological records confirmed unfavorable conditions that night: clouds, rain, and limited visibility, all of which reduced the probability that a live jumper could find a clear field and avoid obstruction, and increased the likelihood that physical evidence would be obscured, moved, or destroyed by water and vegetation. The operational choices the hijacker made before and during the flight provide a combined portrait of planning and opportunism. He selected a short flight with a small number of passengers, reducing variables and witnesses. He demanded marked cash and parachutes rather than a large but less traceable sum. The marked bills limited his options for spending but also made the crime more verifiable to investigators. His precise instructions about airspeed, flaps, and heading indicate at least a practical familiarity with the requirements of a mid-air parachute exit, whether learned through formal training, civilian parachute experience, or detailed study. Yet the same plan relied heavily on the element of chance. Weather, wind, and the state of the parachute equipment all mattered and could not be controlled fully from within the cabin. The immediate aftermath emphasized how fragile a forensic trail can be when exposed to wilderness conditions. Initial searches produced little beyond the items left in the cabin and the pilot and attendant's statements. No body was recovered. Over time, the case produced one tangible corroboration. In 1980, a discovery along the Columbia River, 3 rolls of $20 bills totaling $5,800 matched the serial numbers recorded from the ransom. That find anchored the event to the river basin and supported the hypothesis that part of the money had reached the ground in the region below the flight path. Yet it did not close the question of survival. Cash can travel via currents, flood events, or human hands, and the bills offered no direct link to a person. Taken together, the chain of events from boarding to disappearance demonstrates a blend of careful planning and unavoidable uncertainty. The hijacker engineered his means of control selection of flight demands and flight parameters and leveraged a design feature of the aircraft to effect a mid-air exit. The environmental context, night rain, dense forest, and river systems transformed that exit into an operation heavily dependent on probabilistic success. Despite precise procedural choices, the outcome was ambiguous. An audacious escape that left a narrow scale of physical facts and a wide field of plausible reconstructions. That tension between intentional design and environmental randomness is central to understanding why the event produced a clear sequence of actions but no definitive resolution of the man's fate. The D.B. Cooper case endures not because of an abundance of clues, but because of their scarcity. The physical record is remarkably thin: money, parachutes, a tie, a few fingerprints, and eyewitness statements, but each fragment has been studied with extraordinary care. Every recovered item either strengthens or complicates the theories about what happened that night. The following sections examine each main category of evidence, considering what investigators recovered, what those artifacts imply, and where uncertainty still dominates the narrative. The ransom demand was precise: $200,000 in $20 bills. Northwest Orient and the FBI assembled at some from a Seattle bank within hours, photographing and recording the serial numbers of every note. The decision to use small denominations was deliberate. It reduced the risk of easily traceable large bills entering circulation, yet still allowed the Bureau to track them if they surfaced. For years, agents distributed lists of those serial numbers to banks, casinos, and law enforcement agencies nationwide, hoping a careless transaction would betray the hijacker's identity. But for nearly a decade, nothing appeared. In February 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram discovered 3 bundles of decaying $20 bills on a sandbar along the Columbia River near Tenaba, roughly 30 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. The total $5,800 matched Cooper's ransom by serial number. The find electrified investigators. For the first time since the hijacking, tangible evidence connected the sky crime to the ground. Laboratory tests on the money revealed clues and complications in equal measure. The rubber bands binding the bills had deteriorated inconsistently, suggesting prolonged exposure to varying moisture levels. The bills were degraded but not shredded, implying they had been buried or submerged and then re-exposed by flood or erosion. Hydrologists studied the Columbia's seasonal flow to determine whether the money could have drifted from the presumed jump zone. Some models showed plausible movement downstream. Others indicated the bill's condition fit better with local burial and later unearthing by natural forces. The find proved one essential fact: at least a portion of Cooper's ransom reached a surface environment near the river, but it failed to clarify the critical questions: how the money arrived, when it was deposited, or who placed it there. No footprints, tools, or human remains were found nearby. The rest of the $200,000 has never been recovered. Thus, the Columbia River discovery stands as both confirmation and enigma. Proof of connection without proof of cause. Cooper's demand for 4 parachutes was the most unusual element of his plan. The choice for multiple chutes forced authorities to deliver them under the assumption that some might be used to shield hostages. It also gave him options. The FBI secured 2 primary chutes and 2 reserves from a local skydiving school, though one reserve was later found to have been non-functional, stitched closed for training use only. Investigators quickly realized that not all of the equipment was suitable for a low-altitude, high-risk jump. The Boeing 727's rear, unique among commercial aircraft of its time, allowed for an unprecedented mid-air exit. Cooper's instructions to the pilots: maintain a low speed of around 170 knots, stay below 10,000 feet, extend flaps to 15 degrees, and keep landing gear down, were consistent with conditions favorable for a survivable jump. These technical details suggested familiarity with aircraft dynamics and possibly parachuting experience. But even with those precautions, the conditions outside were harsh. Rain was falling, visibility was poor, and the wind chill at that altitude dropped below freezing. Parachuting experts later assessed that the chosen equipment offered limited control. The chutes were older, military-style canopies that provided stability but little maneuverability. Steering them required strength and skill, particularly in darkness over rough terrain. The combination of a stitched reserve, variable canopy behavior, and limited altitude sharply reduced survival odds. Analysts also noted that the aft air stair created unpredictable turbulence. The airflow beneath the fuselage could buffet a jumper violently, risking canopy collapse or line twist. After the hijacking, none of the chutes used was recovered from the ground. Search teams combed likely landing zones for months, finding no trace of canopy, fabric, or harness hardware. The absence of recovery could indicate that the parachute fell into water, became entangled and concealed by forest canopy, or degraded over time. Alternatively, if the jumper survived, he might have retrieved and disposed of the gear deliberately. As with the money, the lack of conclusive material evidence allows multiple interpretations: death by misadventure or calculated disappearance. Inside the aircraft, investigators found very few personal belongings. The most notable item was a black clip-on tie left on seat 18, either hijacker's seat. Affixed to it was a Mother Veuve tie clip. The tie was a cheap, mass-produced brand sold widely in department stores during the 1960s. It offered no unique manufacturing mark to narrow identification. However, the FBI preserved it meticulously, swabbing for fingerprints, fibers, and later, microscopic residue. In 1971, forensic DNA analysis did not exist. Investigators relied on traditional methods such as fingerprinting and textile comparison. Partial prints were recovered from the aircraft cabin, but none matched those in FBI databases. The tie, when re-examined decades later with modern equipment, produced trace particles of rare metals titanium and stainless steel, alloys suggesting possible exposure to aerospace manufacturing or engineering environments. This finding reopened speculation that Cooper might have worked in an industrial or aeronautical setting. Aligning with his apparent knowledge of aircraft operation, the absence of other belongings was itself informative. No luggage, documents, or personal identifiers were found. Cooper carried only his briefcase, presumed to hold a bomb and possibly minimal accessories. The note he handed to the flight attendant was retrieved but lost later due to mishandling during the early investigation. Handwriting analyses relied on copies of copies, limiting reliability. His beverage order, a bourbon and soda, yielded a glass that contained partial prints. Again, inconclusive. Together, these cabin tracers construct a picture of deliberate anonymity. The hijacker seemed to know what to leave behind: objects too generic to trace, yet distinctive enough to distract. The tie may have been an intentional decoy or simply an overlooked item during the tense final minutes before his jump. Either way, it remains the only physical object still in FBI custody directly linked to the man. The crew of Flight 305 provided the narrative backbone of the case. Their testimonies are remarkably consistent on core events despite natural variations in detail. The lead flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, described the hijacker as calm, polite, and articulate, a man who smiled occasionally, avoided profanity, and never displayed overt aggression. She recalled that he spoke with a quiet, educated tone and seemed familiar with aviation terminology. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with dark hair and olive complexion. Captain William Scott and First Officer William Ratachak confirmed that the hijacker's technical requests specific airspeed, altitude, and flap settings were plausible for maintaining aircraft stability while opening the rear stairs. They noted slight pressure fluctuations, consistent with the door lowering around 8:13 p.m. An abrupt change in tail pressure and pitch trim indicated the moment the man likely jumped. The pilots did not witness the exit but immediately recorded the time and coordinates in the flight log, establishing the framework for all subsequent ground searches. Witness testimony is invaluable but not infallible. Under stress, human memory can distort peripheral details. Yet in this case, cross-verification between crew members produced a coherent sequence: the note delivery, the ransom negotiation, the passenger release, the refueling delay in Seattle, and the aircraft's second takeoff toward Reno, the designated refueling stop en route to Mexico City. The crew's recollections, supported by log entries and radio transmissions, allowed investigators to reconstruct the event minute by minute. The psychological composure of the hijacker stood out. He remained courteous throughout, tipping the flight attendants with a portion of the ransom for their cooperation. He declined food, smoked cigarettes, and kept his tone businesslike. That demeanor contributed to the widespread impression that he was a professional, someone trained to stay calm under pressure. It also complicated post-event profiling, as no witness described behavior consistent with intoxication, panic, or inexperience. When considered individually, each piece of evidence, the money, parachutes, cabin items, and witness accounts, offers only limited insight. Together, however, they form an interlocking pattern. The ransom money's partial recovery links the air crime to physical geography. The parachute details reveal technical competence and risk. The cabin items show intent to erase identity. The crew statements fix time, tone, and procedure. In combination, these strands depict a coherent, methodical operation executed by someone confident in both aviation and human psychology. Despite decades of re-examination, the evidence leaves major questions unresolved. No forensic sample has ever tied the tie or other items to a known suspect. The partial DNA obtained from the tie in the 2000s is incomplete and cannot confirm or eliminate most candidates. No bills beyond the Columbia River discovery have entered circulation, indicating either that the rest was destroyed, hidden, or remains unrecovered. No parachute fragments or gear have been identified despite multiple false leads over the years. Each data point narrows possibility but does not resolve it. The money proves the jump was real and reached the ground. The parachutes confirm intent but not outcome. The tie implies occupational context but not identity. The testimonies establish character but cannot identify a face in a database. The enduring mystery lies not in the absence of evidence, but in its insufficiency for definitive linkage. The physical and testimonial record of the D.B. Cooper hijacking forms a mosaic of precision and absence. Investigators know exactly what happened aboard Flight 305. A calm man orchestrated a ransom exchange, released hostages, and vanished through a rear stair into storm and darkness. They possess physical tokens of that reality: a tie, a few fingerprints, a partial DNA trace, and a handful of decayed bills washed ashore years later. What they lack is the connecting tissue that transforms those items into a single human identity. In modern forensic terms, the case represents a study in limitation. The evidence base is too narrow for absolute conclusions, yet too specific to dismiss. It outlines a controlled, deliberate crime whose physical traces were minimized by design and erased by nature. The ransom money on the Columbia River, the questionable parachute gear, the ordinary tie, and the calm recollections of a terrified crew together describe a singular event that is both fully documented and forever unresolved. The evidence confirms a hijacking, a jump, and a disappearance. It does not confirm who D.B. Cooper was or whether he survived to spend the night beneath the same stars he vanished into. After establishing what happened aboard Flight 305 and cataloging the physical traces left behind, investigators turned their attention to people who might plausibly have planned and executed the hijacking. Over decades, the case produced a long roster of names, some fleeting, some sustained, with 3 individuals repeatedly receiving the most public attention: Richard McCoy Jr., Robert W. Rackstraw, and a privately identified figure sometimes referred to as L.D. Cooper, Lynn Doyle Cooper. Beyond them, hundreds of other suspects were investigated and largely excluded. The following section analyzes each principal candidate against the known facts, explains why each attracted suspicion, and assesses how the evidence supports or undermines their candidacy. The aim is to evaluate likelihood based on documentation rather than rumor, recognizing that absence of proof is not proof of absence. Transitioning from evidence to identity required investigators to match a behavioral and technical profile to persons with compatible backgrounds. The operative profile that emerged: calm under pressure, some parachuting or aviation experience, and familiarity with aircraft performance-guided inquiries. Each named suspect will be measured against that profile and against hard anchors, time, physical forensic traces, and post-crime behavior. Richard McCoy Jr. Imitation, not originator. Richard McCoy entered the public frame because of striking method similarities. A few months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy, a former Army helicopter pilot and Vietnam veteran, carried out a virtually identical crime. He hijacked a United Airlines Boeing 720, demanded ransom, and jumped from the aft stairs with a parachute. The parallel in technique and aircraft type made him an obvious candidate for retrospective scrutiny into whether he could have been Cooper or whether he had merely copied Cooper's method. On closer analysis, the similarities were less dispositive than they first appeared. Investigators compared timelines, physical descriptions, and alibis. McCoy's age, height, and facial features did not match the composite sketches derived from Flight 305 crew recollections. His service and civilian records provided verifiable whereabouts, placing him away from Portland at critical times in late 1971. Most importantly, after McCoy's 1972 hijacking and subsequent arrest, no ransom serials, parachute evidence, or confessions linked him to the earlier Cooper case. McCoy's 1972 crime is better interpreted as a copycat act, someone who studied a sensational case and replicated its headline elements rather than as the original perpetrator. The assessment therefore distinguishes behavioral mimicry from forensic linkage. McCoy had motive and capability to mimic Cooper. He did not have the proven connection to be declared Cooper. The absence of matching physical evidence, no recovered ransom in his possession, no matching fingerprints, and no reliable eyewitness identification tying him to Flight 305 led investigators to exclude him as the original hijacker. His case illustrates how similarity of method can mislead when not supported by concrete time, location corroboration. Robert W. Rackstraw, plausible profile. Limited proof. Robert Rackstraw represents a different kind of suspect, one whose biography superficially fits the operational profile. A decorated Vietnam-era veteran, pilot, and parachutist with knowledge of airborne operations, Rackstraw possessed the technical skills the hijacker appeared to demonstrate. Over the years, various journalists, private investigators, and amateur sleuths pointed to Rackstraw based on circumstantial markers, his service record, travel history, and a handful of cryptic statements or behaviors that, in hindsight, could be read as suggestive. However, circumstantial plausibility and narrative fit are not substitutes for linkage. The FBI examined Rackstraw thoroughly and found no conclusive forensic connection. When material evidence preserved from Flight 305, notably the tie and partial prints, was re-examined using evolving techniques, results did not provide a definitive match to Rackstraw. Witnesses who had seen the hijacker were shown photographs and remained uncertain or inconsistent about identifying him. Additionally, some purported cryptic codes or messages linked to Rackstraw by private researchers have been disputed by experts who caution that pattern seeking can create false positives. Finding meaningful sequences in noise case demonstrates the persistent temptation to retrofit a narrative around an individual whose life story fits the myth. Investigative rigor required positive links, travel or financial records placing him near Portland at the precise time, possession or spending of ransom bills traceable to him, or forensic matches to physical items from the aircraft. Those elements were lacking. Public fascination with Rackstraw, fueled by books and documentaries, kept his name prominent, but on evidentiary grounds the association remained speculative. The FBI's official position effectively treated him as unproven. Private theories continue, but they rest largely on inference rather than a chain of corroboration sufficient for prosecutorial. ACTION LD Cooper Lynn Doyle Cooper. Family led without material corroboration. LD Cooper's candidacy arose through a family member's recollection rather than through initial investigative indicators. Anecdotal accounts described a relative returning home around the Thanksgiving period in a suspicious physical state, dirty, injured, and evasive, prompting speculation that he might have been involved. The coincidence of surname Cooper added immediate popular allure to the hypothesis. Critically, however, the evidentiary threshold required more than familial memories. Investigators sought documentary corroboration, employment records, travel receipts, eyewitness placement, and any material ties to ransom funds. None of those anchors materialized. DNA testing of preserved items, when possible, did not substantively link family members to the physical trace evidence. The coincidence of a shared surname is statistically weak. Cooper is not an uncommon name, and memories reported decades later are vulnerable to confabulation and conflation with public narratives. Analytically, the LD Cooper lead underscores an important principle. Memories and personal anecdotes are vectors for leads but require independent validation. Without physical corroboration, financial, forensic, or documentary, the family-based hypothesis could not withstand exclusionary testing. Investigators accordingly deprioritized the lead in the absence of confirming evidence. The broader field, hundreds considered, few sustained beyond those headline names. The FBI and other investigators reviewed more than 800 potential suspects over the years. The large number reflects both exhaustive diligence and the challenges of a case that captured public attention. The methods of exclusion were routine and methodical: alibi verification through employment and travel logs, fingerprint and handwriting comparisons, tracing of the ransom serial numbers to bank accounts or purchases, and interviews to test behavioral consistency with witness descriptions. Many individuals were cleared through employment records or family testimony. Others were eliminated by mismatch in physical description or lack of access to parachuting or aviation skills. A common pattern in the broader suspect pool is the interplay of weak circumstantial indicators. In the archival limits of the early 1970s, paper records, incomplete travel manifests, and less systematic intercancy data sharing made it difficult to reconstruct precise movements for many people. In later decades, advances in forensic science and digital record linkage allowed re-examination of cold leads, but deterioration or loss of original evidence often blunted such efforts. Particular investigative challenges recurred across the hundreds of inquiries. First, the absence of unique, high-confidence forensic identifiers, complete DNA profiles, a clear fingerprint match, or unequivocal possession of ransom money meant that most eliminations were based on negative evidence rather than positive attribution. Second, the passage of time eroded the evidentiary field. Witnesses aged and died, memories dimmed, and physical materials degraded or were misplaced. These realities converted many plausible leads into unresolvable inquiries. Synthesis, weighing probability against proof when measured against the forensic and circumstantial record, a consistent pattern emerges. Many men had means or motive or skill, but very few matched the full matrix that the case required: opportunity, presence in the Pacific Northwest at the precise time, capability, parachute and aircraft knowledge, identifiable forensic linkage prints, DNA, possession of marked bills, and post-crime behavior consistent with survival or concealment. The three high-profile suspects illustrate typical failure modes. McCoy aligned on method but not on presence. Rackstraw aligned on skill but not on corroboration. LD Cooper aligned on anecdote but not on documentation. Investigative prudence, therefore, favored exclusion in the absence of convergent proof. The FBI's eventual decision to scale back active investigation reflected not the absence of possible suspects, but the absence of new, testable evidence capable of producing the decisive link required for prosecution. That reality does not resolve the case. It instead defines why the case remains open in public imagination but closed in practical law enforcement terms. Conclusion: identity unresolved despite exhaustive inquiry in some. The suspect record of the D.B. Cooper case is a study in evidentiary asymmetry. A small cluster of hard facts anchors the event. A large field of human possibilities orbits those facts without intersecting them decisively. The principal named suspects each fit portions of the profile but failed the integrated evidentiary test. Hundreds of others were investigated and cleared by documentary or forensic disconfirmation, without the emergence of an unambiguous linked DNA that ties a name to the preserved tie, discovery of a larger portion of the ransom with traceable ownership, or a verifiable confession accompanied by corroborating facts. The question of who jumped from Flight 305 remains unresolved. The case therefore stands as both an exemplar of thorough investigative effort and a reminder of how the absence of a single, decisive artifact can leave a well-documented crime without a proven perpetrator. ******. The disappearance of the man who called himself Dan Cooper produced 3 enduring explanatory frameworks. 1. He died during or immediately after the parachute jump. 2. He survived the jump and successfully disappeared. And 3. The exit was aided by collusion or staged in some way. Each theory draws on the same narrow set of facts: aircraft behavior and configuration, the parachutes and their condition, the partial recovery of ransom money, and crew testimony, but interprets those facts differently. The following analysis treats each hypothesis in turn, evaluates supporting and contradicting evidence, and weighs overall plausibility, while avoiding speculation that goes beyond what the evidentiary record can support. The Dathon jump hypothesis rests first on environmental and technical risk factors. Cooper exited into a November night that featured rain, low visibility, and cold temperatures. The likely landing area: wooded river valleys and uneven terrain in southwestern Washington offered few safe open fields and many hazards: mature evergreens, steep banks, bogs, and fast-moving water. Parachute performance under those conditions is unforgiving. The chutes the airline supplied were civilian gear, not specialized military or high-performance durable canopies. At least one reserve was later described as altered or effectively closed, and anecdotal reports suggest the overall equipment was older and not uniformly reliable. Low exit altitude reduces time for canopy, inflation, and stabilization. Brief falls into trees or shifting water can hide bodies and gear quickly. From a probabilistic standpoint, a night jump into that environment with marginal equipment creates a high likelihood of non-survivable outcomes. The partial recovery of marked bills in the Columbia River basin supports the idea that at least some material from the descent found its way into the watershed. The monies state water damage and silt fits, scenarios where items were lost to or transported by river systems. Authorities and many independent analysts therefore consider death by misadventure the most parsimonious explanation. Given base rates for low-altitude jumps and the documented environmental hazards, the simplest reading is that the jumper did not survive. Yet the death hypothesis faces meaningful empirical gaps. No body was ever recovered despite intensive searches, and no parachute, canopy, or harness hardware definitively tied to the exit was found in the probable corridor. In heavily forested terrain, bodies and gear can be concealed by canopy, washed into river systems, or scavenged natural mechanisms that plausibly explain their absence. But 9 years passed before any ransom money surfaced, and the limited recovery of $5,800 does not, on its own, prove fatal outcome. It only proves that some currency entered the river environment. Moreover, if a corpse had remained intact and discoverable for a time near agricultural or logging activity, there were numerous opportunities for discovery over the ensuing decades. The absence of such a report leaves open the alternative that evidence was removed or never present in an easily discoverable form. In short, while the weight of environmental and technical indicators favors death, the absence of a body or canopy prevents absolute certainty. The survival landscape hypothesis posits that Cooper either executed a controlled landing or immediately reached a rendezvous point and disappeared. This scenario requires one or more of the following: exceptional parachuting skill, careful selection of a landing zone, prearranged ground assistance, or a combination of those elements. Several aspects of Cooper's behavior on the flight support the plausibility of planning: the precise list of demands, marked bills, multiple chutes, the specific flight configuration he requested, reduced speed, flap set, and his calm, methodical demeanor. Those details suggest someone who either had prior parachuting experience or had researched the requirements for a jump from a 727. If he had skills beyond the average recreational jump in military static line or freefall operations, he would have had a higher chance of choosing a patch of ground that allowed survival and rapid concealment. The survival thesis gains some circumstantial support from the political and social context. A person with military or paramilitary experience could plausibly melt into post-1970s America by changing names, moving to remote areas, or adopting low-profile livelihoods that avoided banked transactions traceable to marked bills. Proponents also point to the alleged post-crime letters claiming responsibility or taunting authorities, interpreting them as evidence of a living perpetrator who felt secure enough to provoke investigators. However, those letters were never authenticated to the satisfaction of investigators. Many were dismissed as hoaxes. Equally important, survival imposes testable expectations that remain unmet. If Cooper survived and spent the ransom for ordinary goods or services, some notes should eventually have been found in circulation, deposited in banks, or linked to purchases. The limited recovery of bills suggests either extraordinary caution in spending, disposal of the money, or hiding the funds in ways that avoided detection for decades. The survival scenario thus requires additional positive assumptions, coordinated ground pickup, precise timing, or extraordinary operational luck that lack direct corroboration in the record. While not impossible, those assumptions reduce the explanatory parsimony of the survival model compared with the death hypothesis. The collusion or staged escape hypothesis considers whether cooperation from an accomplice on the ground, airline staff, or less plausibly, official complicity played a role in enabling a clean getaway. In principle, collusion could supply the critical missing link of a post-jump extraction, a vehicle waiting at a river landing, an associate to recover parachute gear, or a pre-planned cache of clothing and cash. Such arrangements would dramatically increase the probability of survival and explain the paucity of recoverable physical evidence. The mechanics are straightforward. A jumper lands in a rough area, quickly sheds conspicuous gear, moves to a short-distance rendezvous, and is retrieved. The lack of parachute debris could be consistent with intentional retrieval and destruction. However, collusion demands multiple coordinated actors maintaining silence for decades, an inherently fragile arrangement. Investigators interviewed airline personnel and searched for evidence of inside assistance. While procedural lapses and human error existed, no conclusive documentation demonstrated coordinated complicity. Similarly, the idea that the FBI or other agencies staged or concealed aspects of the incident lacks substantiation and would imply institutional malfeasance on a scale unlikely to remain secret. The collusion hypothesis can explain absence of evidence, but it shifts the burden to prove a conspiracy, which requires evidence of communications, payments, or eyewitness testimony implicating named individuals. To date, none of those items has surfaced with verifiable provenance. The collusion theory therefore remains speculative and less supported than models grounded in environmental and technical explanation. Weighing these hypotheses requires attention to both the evidentiary anchor points and probabilistic reasoning. Anchor facts are few and stable. Cooper demanded and received $200,000. The aircraft returned to the air under specific flight parameters. The rear stair was lowered and an exit occurred, and some marked bills later turned up on the Columbia River. From those anchors, the death hypothesis requires the fewest additional assumptions. It explains the river recovery plausibly through natural deposition or loss during a chaotic descent, and accounts for the absence of a stable trail. By invoking environmental concealment, the survival hypothesis requires more complex assumptions, prearranged ground support, remarkable stealth in handling funds, or exceptional post-exit tradecraft, but cannot be ruled out entirely because the physical record is not definitive. Collusion adds an extra layer of coordination that would neatly solve many evidentiary puzzles, but is undermined by the lack of direct proof and by the practical difficulties of sustained secrecy. Beyond immediate evidentiary comparisons, behavioral and forensic considerations inform plausibility. The hijacker's calm demeanor and specificity in demands point toward competence and planning. Competence raises the probability of a controlled jump or prearranged extraction. But competence alone does not guarantee survival under poor conditions. Forensic limits also matter. Forensic science in the 1970s could not produce DNA profiles or microtrace analyses at today's standard, and even modern reanalysis is limited by degradation of materials and incomplete chain of custody preservation. The passage of time favors explanations that do not depend on the recovery of fragile materials, again tilting toward conclusion that physical concealment by environment or intentional removal explains the evidentiary gaps. In summation, the balance of probabilities based on environmental danger, parachute limitations, and the partial recovery of money in riverine context leans toward the conclusion that Cooper most likely did not survive his exit. Survival remains a defensible possibility, particularly if ground assistance existed, but it requires additional speculative assumptions unsupported by direct evidence. Collusion is possible in theory, but even less supported. Ultimately, the case remains a study in evidentiary asymmetry. A handful of indisputable facts produces multiple plausible narratives, and without a decisive new material, Lincoln authenticated DNA matched to preserved evidence. The discovery of a larger portion of the ransom with traceable ownership, or a credible, corroborated confession, the question of Dan Cooper's final fate will remain probabilistic rather than certain. Asterisk. The D.B. Cooper case exposed not just an astonishing crime but also the practical limits of criminal investigation. In an era before modern forensic and data resources, understanding why the case remained unresolved requires a clear look at the technological, environmental, organizational, and social constraints that shaped the response and the policy lessons that emerged thereafter. First, forensic technology in 1971 was primitive by contemporary standards. DNA profiling did not exist. Trace level, chemical and microevidence analysis were rudimentary, and digital records, phone logs, banking databases, travel manifests were paper-based or non-existent. Investigators relied heavily on eyewitness descriptions, fingerprint checks, handwriting analysis, and manual cross-referencing of paper files. Those methods could establish timelines and profiles but lacked the discriminating power to link a degraded physical item to a single individual decades after an event. Even items that might have been rich sources of identification, clothing, fibers, soil, or latent prints were subject to degradation through handling, environmental exposure, and imperfect storage. In short, the evidentiary tools needed to transform plausible suspect into proven perpetrator simply were not available at scale. Second, the physical environment of the likely landing area greatly complicated recovery efforts. The suspected corridor below the aircraft's flight path encompasses dense forest, bogs, river channels, and shifting banks terrain that conceals and disperses material evidence rapidly. Weather compounded those issues. November rains swell rivers, rearrange banks, and accelerate decomposition. Search teams working in such conditions face a low signal-to-noise ratio. Even substantial search efforts frequently fail to locate well-concealed remains or small caches of items. The fact that only a modest portion of the ransom sink or vehicle awaited dollars surfaced years later underlines how readily evidence can disappear, be buried, or be transported by water systems. The geography effectively reduced the probability of recovery to a matter of chance as much as skill. Third, the sheer number of suspects and leads placed real limits on investigative prioritization. The FBI and local authorities processed hundreds of tips, examined more than 800 named suspects, and followed thousands of leads. That scale created a resource allocation problem. Each lead required verification, interviews, and documentary checks, and the backlog could grow faster than it could be cleared. Given limited manpower and finite budget, investigators had to prioritize leads that offered the highest probability of yielding linkage evidence. Over time, promising avenues were exhausted and attention shifted to corroborative rather than exploratory work. The result is a pragmatic but frustrating reality. Some lines of inquiry received only cursory attention because more immediately testable leads consumed time and funds. Fourth, media coverage and public pressure both aided and impeded the investigation. Intense press interest kept the case in the public eye and maintained political pressure to solve it, which helped secure investigative resources early on. However, sensational coverage also generated noise. Hoax, letters, false confessions, and amateur sleuthing flooded the investigative pipeline. Media-driven narratives shaped public expectations, demanding a quick arrest or a dramatic breakthrough that did not align with the slow, methodical pace of forensic work. At times, publicity may have hampered the preservation of evidence or the integrity of witness recollections as stories circulated and mimetic details became reinforced. The interplay between investigative rigor and journalistic appetite created an information environment where useful leads were mixed with distraction. Fifth, the institutional lessons for aviation security were stark and enduring. The Cooper hijacking highlighted specific procedural vulnerabilities: open access to boarding, lack of standardized baggage screening, and the existence of an in-flight exit, the 727's aft stair. that could be exploited under particular flight conditions. In response, airlines and regulators implemented incremental and then systemic changes. Improved passenger and baggage screening procedures, stricter controls over access to exit mechanisms, revised crew training for hostage and hijacking scenarios, and enhanced coordination with law enforcement for airborne threats. Over the subsequent decades, these measures evolved into the layered security environment. Passengers experience today metal detectors, X-ray screening, secure cockpit doors, and mandatory briefing and reporting procedures, each a response to known exploit points revealed by cases like Cooper's. Taken together, these constraints and lessons tell a broader story about the evolution of criminal justice and public safety. The Cooper case demonstrated that procedural and technological gaps can be exploited by a determined individual, and that closing those gaps requires both technical innovation and institutional will. It also showed the limits of post hoc reconstruction in complex physical environments. When an event is short, deliberate, and occurs in terrain that naturally erases traces, investigators need either immediate high-quality evidence or an extraordinary stroke of luck to identify the perpetrator. Operationally, several practical recommendations emerged from the post-incident analysis. Standardize the marking of high denomination, ransom, or government-supplied currency in hostage situations. IMP, ROVE, chain of custody and evidence preservation protocols aboard aircraft and in airport environments. Expand pre-deployment training for flight crews on recognizing and documenting subtle threats, and develop coordinated rapid response search plans that integrate aerial, ground, and hydrological expertise when evidence may enter water systems. Many of these recommendations have been institutionalized in subsequent decades, reflecting a learning curve from accident and exploitation to mitigation and control. Finally, there is an epistemic lesson. Great mysteries often persist not because investigators were incompetent, but because the world conspires by weather, terrain, time, and the limitations of period technology to erase decisive clues. The Cooper case is a study in probabilistic reasoning under scarcity. Investigators established a tight fact pattern: a ransom demand, a controlled exchange, a planned exit, and a partial recovery of money. What they could not do was convert those facts into a unique identity. The investigative limits were therefore less a moral failing than a factual one. The forensic and environmental odds were stacked against definitive closure. In sum, the D.B. Cooper investigation spotlighted the need for better forensic tools, faster and more coordinated field response in challenging terrain, smarter allocation of investigative resources, more disciplined interaction with media, and concrete aviation security reforms. Those lessons reshaped policy and practice well beyond the specifics of the case. The cold file that remains is as much a testament to those institutional changes as it is an artifact of the investigative boundaries of its time. More than half a century after that cold November night, the D.B. Cooper hijacking remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Despite the longest and most extensive investigation of its kind, the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, acknowledging that all credible leads had been exhausted. The Bureau's statement made clear that while resources would be redirected to more pressing matters, any genuinely new evidence, particularly verified DNA or a significant physical find, would reopen the inquiry. In essence, the file is dormant, not buried, waiting for a clue strong enough to break through 50 years of speculation. The case has long since transcended law enforcement into the realm of American mythology. Cooper, whether a criminal mastermind or a doomed risk-taker, became a symbol of rebellion, audacity, and mystery. His image has inspired countless books, documentaries, and feature films. His story echoed in television references, songs, and even local festivals in the Pacific Northwest. The name D.B. Cooper, a mistaken journalistic transcription of Dan Cooper, now represents a cultural archetype, the outlaw who vanishes perfectly, leaving only questions. For many, Cooper occupies the same imaginative space as legends of the American frontier, a lone figure who defied authority and disappeared into the wilderness, transformed by myth into something larger than life. Yet beneath the fascination lies a cautionary narrative. The Cooper hijacking was a turning point in aviation security, marking the end of an era when passengers could walk freely to an airplane with little scrutiny. Within months, the FAA and airlines implemented stricter boarding procedures, installed metal detectors, and later required reinforced cockpit doors. Boeing modified the 727 to prevent AFSTAIR deployment in flight, a direct response to Cooper's escape. These measures reshaped how Americans perceived air travel, prioritizing safety and control over openness and ease. In that sense, Cooper's crime forced an entire industry and government apparatus to evolve. From a modern investigative perspective, the case highlights the fragility of evidence and the power of time. Without genetic databases, satellite imaging, or digital surveillance, 1970s investigators were constrained to human observation and physical search, tools that could not withstand decades of decay and uncertainty. Today, improved DNA sequencing or material trace analysis could one day identify a suspect if preserved samples yield viable data. But until that discovery emerges, the Cooper case exists in a suspended state, a meticulously documented event without resolution, a historical anomaly immune to closure. In the end, the legacy of D.B. Cooper lies not in the money stolen or the mystery unsolved, but in the intersection between myth and memory, how a single, precisely executed act transformed both criminal investigation and public imagination. His story warns of the vulnerabilities of systems once thought secure and reminds us that, even in an age of surveillance and science, some questions resist final answers. Cooper's leap into the storm was not only a physical escape but a symbolic one from identification, from accountability, and ultimately, from history itself. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of SoulSpeak. The story of D.B. Cooper isn't just about a man who vanished into the night, it's about how far we'll go to chase the truth, even when it stays just out of reach. What do you think really happened to D.B. Cooper? Did he die in the storm, or did he outsmart everyone and walk away free? Share your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. And if you enjoyed diving into this mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow SoulSpeak for more real stories, real crimes, and the secrets that still keep us wondering.